I'm going to give you my normal little film review, but I'm also going to answer this question. The question isn't how do I approach movies? The better question is how do I experience them? Now, because I go into movies with the intention of doing a review, I'd say maybe 85% of the time, I do try to approach a movie as blind as possible. So I'm not going to watch interviews. I'm not going to watch the press tour, behind the scenes. The only thing I'm going to watch is whatever trailer is showing in the theater, or whenever like the trailer first drops, like on Twitter or YouTube, I'll watch that. But I'm not going to watch every trailer. I'm not going to, oversaturate myself with this movie, do deep dive research. I want to go into it as blind as possible and just see what my little brain comes up with. I want to be as objective as I can. Does that make sense? But overall, I don't think I approach movies any different than anyone else. Now, how do I experience movies? I feel like that's a much better question. That is definitely different. Not because I'm so special or so smart. It's because I studied this. And I think anyone who has studied film, whether that was in a classroom setting, a college setting, or it's because they have it's a hobby for them. It's something they have done on their own. I think everyone can relate. You experience movies differently once you've studied them. And there's no going back from that. What year is it? 2024? So it's been 15-ish years since I was in a film class, and I still break down movies the way I was taught. It is beyond habit. Again, there's no turning that off. And I think anyone who has ever studied film to whatever degree would say the exact same thing. If you enjoy just going to the movies and having a good time, never take a film class. It will ruin the experience for you. But how I experience movies, I think the movie I just saw is a pretty good example of just how ruined I am. All right, so I just saw Slingshot. Let's talk about it. Directed by Mikael Hofström. God, I hope so. He's from Sweden. Stars Casey Affleck, Lawrence Fishburne, and Tomer Capone. Why is everyone's name so difficult today? So this is about a dude named John. John is an astronaut, and he is hoping to be selected to go on a trip to Titan. If I'm not mistaken, this is one of the moons of Jupiter. And it's a big deal. It's something he's worked his whole life for. And in the middle of, this selection process, he meets this woman named Zoe, and they begin a bit of a relationship. But the thing about John is he's an only child. He's a bit of a loner. He really doesn't have much on Earth that's worth sticking around for or missing. His whole life, his whole tunnel vision is all about this trip. Well, we're on this ship with him, plus his two, crewmates, or whatever you call them in a spaceship. We have Captain Franks and then Nash. Every sci-fi movie that I've seen that has some sort of deep space theme has this to a degree, whether they call it, hibernation or a deep sleep or cryo sleep, where they put their passengers into a deep sleep for long periods of time. And this movie is called Hibernation. And they have these 90-day hibernation cycles where they're asleep for essentially 3 months. They wake up, they do maintenance on the ship, or they check on the ship, run tests, see where they're at, talk to Houston, and then they go back to sleep for another 90 days. And the thing about hibernation is that the drugs used to induce this deep sleep has crazy side effects. So while they're on this ship preparing for what's called Slingshot, which is when they get into Jupiter's orbit and they're able to kind of launch themselves closer to Titan, John starts to lose his mind a little bit. Nash has completely lost his mind, and it seems that Captain Franks is just, very steady on his feet, seems to have that very leader quality. The movie itself is either going to be a hit or miss. You're either going to like it or you're not. It has a very slow, very, I don't want to say dull pace, but just kind of like a very passive pace. It definitely follows Casey Affleck's lead, and if you know anything about him as an actor, he's very chill. He's very passive. He's very cool. Great actor, though. It was very interesting that they took that route with him, where they kind of let a bit of his personality kind of shine through. This kind of passive, easygoing guy who kind of sits in the middle between these two extremes. This guy who's just stoic, walls built up, very domineering, commanding leader, and this, second mate, so to speak. I don't know the astronaut terminology for it, who has lost his ever-loving mind. Now, this is where the experience part comes in, because the first thing I noticed is that we're going back between the present and flashbacks. Flashbacks when he's in the selection process and he first meets Zoe, and I noticed that he looks different. He's a little more put together. His hair is longer. He has a mustache. He seems to be a bit more fit, it seems, happier, and more awake. There's definitely a difference in his appearance as opposed to when he's on the ship, where he is almost clean shaven, his hair is shorter, his bag's under his eyes, he's tired, and he's dreary, and he's just mentally drained. The second thing I notice is that when we're on a ship, this is something I always notice. It's something I take notice of, or I always pay attention to, is when we're on a ship in a deep space movie, I always want to pay attention to the space. How are we occupying the space? How is the space being used to build the tension and the tone? Because with space movies, because they're in this ship, it's a little more claustrophobic. And I think depending on how the mood is supposed to go within the movie, you can build on that a bit. It's a little more compact. It's claustrophobic, tight quarters, especially when you're dealing with more than one person. So then you have a little bit of cabin fever that comes in with that. And also being in deep space, there's a sense of loneliness and you can't escape it. You're trapped. All walls around you. There's no getting out of it. So that's something else I pay attention to. And I also look at characters. So something I noticed from the jump that really just stuck out to me was the fact that we have three distinct characters. They're very different from one another, and they're three extremes. This extreme passive middle, this extreme neurotic, and this extreme stoic. And I'm like, that's so interesting. It's almost like you have three parts of a whole split evenly into three. Literally my thought when I first saw these three characters. It's like, that's very interesting the way they did that. Again, I'm not like a super smart person. I'm not highly intellectual. I made the mistake of studying this in college and now I'm ruined for the rest of my life. Something also that stood out to me was the fact that his name was John. Very generic, very simple, but also there's something very heavy about the name John. And I think we get this name because it's easy to remember, it's hard to forget, and it sticks with you for a minute because his name becomes very important at the end. And then you realize at some point, all we know about this man is that his name is John. And as we get into the movie, because of the side effects of these drugs used to induce hibernation, he starts to have hallucinations. So now I'm confused. What's real and what's not? So now I realize we're dealing with an unreliable narrator. About halfway through, I realize that we're only seeing what he sees. We never go beyond the ship. We're only seeing maybe 4 or 5 places on this ship altogether, and it's only the places where he goes and where he's been. There are never like scenes or shots that show us what someone else is doing or, an empty space and something happening there, except for the places where he has been, like this crawl space where there seems to be a dent in the ship. And it's because he's been there that we revisit this place without him. Because it's in the back of his mind, we go there. But because he is hallucinating and he's seeing things, not just visual hallucinations, but auditory hallucinations, we can't really trust what's in front of us because he's unreliable. And because I am me and I get frustrated so easily, I am trying to figure out what's real and what's not. I'm also paying attention to theme and trying to guess or figure out what the movie is trying to communicate. The central message here is just loneliness in general. He says in the beginning of the movie that, he's a loner because she asks him, are you going to miss your family and friends? Like, I'm a loner. He doesn't really have a relationship with his mother. His dad died when he was very young. And this is all that's important to him. And he takes pride in that. And, being the only child, being a loner, being alone. But here's the thing about movies set in deep space, depending on, what the ensemble looks like. Deep space or anything that has to do with like snow, Antarctica, or anything like that, it's always a portrait of loneliness. And it also serves as a metaphor for what happens to the brain when it's alone and how extreme loneliness can be. I don't want to give too much away. I thought that part was beautiful and relatable for me in a way. I thought that was interesting the way this was done. So the movie overall, I think, is just kind of mid. You're either going to like it or you're not. I think what might do you in is the pacing. Whether you can hold with the pacing, I think it's going to determine whether or not this is a good one for you. But I love the music. I love some of the song choices in this. I love Casey Affleck. I love him as an actor. And him with Lawrence Fishburne because they are so different. I love them together in this. So, hey, I enjoyed it for the most part, but I hope that answers your question.